All right, let's finish up the chapter. We're going to do section C today, continuing to talk about the ocean. So the ocean is divided into different zones depending on if you're talking about living things or if you're just talking about the water itself. We're gonna use the zones that are listed in the book for us. There's some good pictures on page 324 and 325 that kind of show this breakdown. Lots of big words, okay? I've just got them listed here and I'm going to define them on the next slide, okay? So we've got the intertidal zone, which you see up here, okay? The littoral zone, which doesn't really show up on this diagram here, but within that littoral zone, we get these benthic organisms and pelagic organisms. Again, I'll define these on the next slide, okay? And then you get out much deeper, okay? So the littoral zone is kind of like this area right here, okay? The open ocean then would be once you go off this continental shelf down the slope, that's the open ocean, okay? And within that, we get what's known as the photic zone. That phot root has to do with light, okay? Then below that, we get the aphotic zone, so A meaning without, okay? I'll define these. And then finally at the bottom is the abyssal zone. That's just down as deep as it gets, okay? So nice little throwback to Finding Nemo. Remember the song, Let's Name the Zones, the Zones, the Zones. He uses these words, these big words in his song, and you can see some of the roots, okay? If I go back here, we've got pelagic and we've got abyssal. And so you can kind of start to see what some of these words would mean when you put them together based on their definition. Totally scientific song in that movie, by the way, which we will watch in class. Okay, so lots of definitions here. So intertidal zone, that's at the very beginning. That's the area between the high and low tide. The organisms that live there, sometimes are covered with water, sometimes they're not, depends on the tide. And that's where we find tide pools, okay? That littoral zone basically goes from the lowest tide line to the very edge of the continental shelf, okay? So it's still somewhat shallow. And so the water there gets plenty of light and it's fairly warm because it's up towards the surface, okay? The benthic organisms, they're not just in that littoral zone. We talk about the benthic and the pelagic organisms even when we get out into the open ocean. But the benthic organisms are those that anchor themselves to the bottom, okay? They're the bottom dwellers. Kelp will root into the ground, mussels, anything that is on the bottom. Pelagic organisms are, fish, whales, dolphins, jellyfish, squid, anything that moves around in the water. Squid and jellyfish specifically, they really just rely on the current and they're just kind of floating around. And they're known as pelagic organisms. All right, the photic zone is from about 100 meters down to about 200 meters depth, okay? Still gets a decent amount of light. There are no benthic organisms because there's no bottom. There's no ground. You could say there's some benthic organisms within the littoral zone because it's not that deep, but the photic zone now is past the continental shelf, okay? So that depth, it has no of those benthic organisms, okay? But the light and the temperature up that high is still fairly similar to that littoral zone. All right, we go deeper. So 200 meters to anywhere between 3,000 and 4,000 meters deep. It's known as the aphotic zone, A meaning without, and that phot meaning light. So this is without light. No light reaches this depth. So we find a lot of animals that have something called bioluminescence, and that's something that allows them to glow, basically. They produce their own light, okay? And get some crazy creatures down there. Beyond that, we get the abyssal zone, and that goes all the way below the aphotic zone, all the way to the ocean floor. Still no light, incredibly cold, lots of pressure because of all the weight of the water above them. And there's this thing known as, what is it called? Marine snow. So basically, because nothing grows down there, there's no plants that grow down there. organic material will fall from the higher zones, and that's where the animals that live there get their nutrients. Okay, and it's known as marine snow. Kind of gross if you think about it. And then even beyond that, so like, you've got the ocean floor, which is the abyssal zone. You might have a trench or something that goes even deeper than that. And that's known as the hadal zones, the deep trenches. And those could have like 1,000 times atmospheric pressure. So if I'm here roughly at sea level with 1 atmosphere, if I'm down to the deepest of the deep, like 6,000 meters to the bottom of some of these trenches, it's like having 1,000 atmospheres pushing down on me. It would crush most animals. So these animals that live in these different zones, they have to stay in those zones because their bodies are adjusted to that temperature and that pressure. Okay. All right, so we've got 2 cycles to talk about. We've got a carbon cycle and a nitrogen cycle to talk about. And they're pretty complicated. We're just going to kind of talk about the basics here. So carbon is one of the main building blocks for all living organisms. Okay, it's known as an organic substance. In fact, if you take organic chemistry in college, it's all about carbon. Okay, but it needs to be replenished. So as living things are using carbon, there needs to be a new supply of carbon. Okay. And there's lots of carbon stored in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. There's a lot of carbon in the oceans. And there's carbon in the Earth's crust. Okay, deep down in the interior, there's a lot of carbon to be had. The marine carbon layer, so this is just involving the ocean now, is basically an exchange of carbon between the water and the atmosphere above it. Okay, but also from some of the plants that are either along the coast or if there's plants growing in the more shallow areas. You're going to learn next year about photosynthesis, and that's an exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. And so that's part of what's happening here with this carbon cycle. But also from the ground, from the layers of the earth, some of the sediment, but also some of the carbon will actually be coming out from underneath the ocean floor there and helping to replenish the carbon within the ocean. Okay. Same thing with nitrogen. This is a super complicated diagram. I couldn't find anything more simple, so don't worry about it too much. But nitrogen is another key ingredient for life, okay? And it also needs to be replenished. Now, you would think we'd have plenty of nitrogen because in the atmosphere, the air we breathe, like 78% of it, most of it is nitrogen. But the form of nitrogen is not usable to living things. We breathe it in and we exhale it right out. We don't use it at all. Plants can't use it. It's the wrong form of nitrogen. So it needs to be fixed. And this process known as nitrogen fixing changes it into a usable form. And oftentimes it's bacteria that do that. Plants need the nitrogen in the soil to be fixed before they can use it. And bacteria in the soil actually do this. Okay. Same with carbon. It's a cycle. It gets used up, it needs to be replenished. If we run out of usable nitrogen, then living things can't go on, okay? Cyanobacteria is a specific kind of bacteria found in the ocean. So again, we're talking about the marine portion of the nitrogen cycle. It helps to fix the nitrogen in the water for those living organisms within the photic zone, okay? So where there's light, they're able to survive and they're able to fix the nitrogen to be used. Okay. Crazy how God created things, man, and balanced it all out. We're going to talk about the water cycle later on. There's all these cycles. Things get used, but then something else happens to replenish it. And so we don't run out. It's a pretty awesome design. All right. That's it. Bye-bye.